Are we on the verge of becoming the disunited states of America? 41% of the voters believe that we are going to have a civil war.
Yes.
He supports Texas becoming its own nation after his life was changed forever by a tragic event.
My son's murderer had been deported 4 times, thumbed his nose at our immigration laws for a 5th time, and for fun blew my son's brains out.
So you feel like the government, through neglect, murdered your son?
I couldn't have asked for a better son than what I got with Spencer. When he was 25, he was getting ready to open his new music store. The night before the grand opening of Spencer's store, a 4-time deported illegal alien that had a long criminal history just pulled up next to Spencer and randomly blew Spencer's brains out. I became very politically involved to try to get something done so other American families wouldn't be subjected to what my family was subjected to. After years of trying to get our federal government to live up to their end of the social contract, I've come to the conclusion that that's a lost cause. And then a few years ago, Daniel Miller turned me on to the Texas nationalist movement. At first, it seemed pretty far-fetched that Texas would leave the Union. But the more I saw the corruption in D.C., it began to make sense. It's time for Texas to fix its own problems and for Washington to get out of the way. I don't want to spend my tax dollars on people like the one that killed my son. Why should Texas be shackled to a government that is working against Texas interests?
First off, I'm very, very sorry for your loss. As a father of 2 boys, and one of them being a musician as well, this one really hit home. I'll never tell you I know how you feel.
Well, I appreciate that. And what's different about it than another type of death, the scab continues to be ripped off when you see every day the way the federal government is treating immigration. And it really leaves you with the feeling of, I guess your son was worth nothing.
And this continues to happen. I've talked to other parents within the last month who have lost children to immigrants that have come across illegally. Some of them 2, 3, 4 times, and murdered their child. When you read about this, see on the news, it's got to take you back as though it's happening all over again.
Yeah, it conjures up all those same feelings. My son's murderer had been deported 4 times. He had a 15-year nasty rap sheet, assaults, robberies. He did 5 years in prison for attempted murder. He just thumbed his nose at our immigration laws for a 5th time, set up shop in Houston, and on January 31st of 2015, at a red light, he just randomly, for fun, blew my son's brains out. And he took out 2 other motorists. He was high on cocaine and alcohol, and he just out fun shooting. Simple as that. That's all.
And your son had no connection with him whatsoever?
None of the
just
people
pulled up
had any
beside him and
connection.
shot him in the head?
Yeah. So I became very politically involved, and I got a good look at Washington, D.C., and I became disillusioned, and it began to come across to me that we're kind of playing politician whack-a-mole in a way, because there's a dark underbelly of D.C. that I think really runs things, and they don't have our best interests at heart at all. And
so you, by association, feel like the government, through neglect, murdered your son?
I've always said that my son's killer was a foot soldier. The generals and the commanders are in the halls of Congress, and obviously in our White House now, but it's in our court systems, and then our mega donors and special interests and people who basically the puppeteers.
You began to subscribe to the ideology set forth in Texit, which is Texas seceding from the United States and functioning as its own country.
Right. Yeah, around about that time when I started getting disillusioned with this, a friend said, you need to read this Texit book. And I went in it as a skeptic, but I read the book, and by the time I finished it, I couldn't poke any holes in it. Mm-hmm. And it started to make a lot of sense to me. This is a very peaceful movement, and I'm down with that. I think that violence is a non-starter.
Right.
August 24th, 1996. That was the date that I made a personal decision to dedicate my life to seeing Texas as a free, independent, self-governing, sovereign nation among nations. And from that time to this, there has never been a time where we are closer to Texit happening.
Well, I'm back with Dan, who joined the Texas nationalist movement, or Texit, after his son was murdered by an illegal immigrant. Also joining us is Daniel, who is considered the modern-day founder of the Texas nationalist movement, or Texit as it's called. You actually wrote a book about this, and your life is dedicated to fighting for Texas independence. Fair statement?
I would say that's fair. 1996, I made the decision to work to see Texas become an independent nation.
And why that solution instead of working within the system?
Well, I tried that. It is very clear that the federal government is unfixable. Because if you think back to how long, every 2 to 4 years, we get paraded by some political messiah who's going to reduce the debt, end federal overreach, to shrink the government. But what have we seen? We've seen the exact opposite thing happen. At what point do you begin to look at the federal debt and say, well, look, this is fiscal child abuse. You know, this is going to be something that we're going to crush our children with. You know, how many Spencers do we have to have before we say we have to do something different? And ultimately, that's what it was. It was a realization that the federal government was unfixable, but we simply want the right to govern ourselves. Look, this has been done 140 other times over the last 70 to 80 years. Well, why not us? You know, how is it that those countries are so much better than us that they can govern themselves? They can control their own border and immigration. They can have their own military and defense policy, their own currency and tax
Okay, well,
policy.
hold it. You're leaving out a big part of the story, though. How many of those that have declared themselves sovereign is it working out for?
It's not always a happy ending, but you have to look at where a lot of those folks started from, right? A lot of those places were not set and suitable, but here we are in Texas. We have the 8th largest economy in the world. If Texas can't make it as an independent nation, then who can?
And if this happens, do you see any problems associated with it?
I don't see any problems. Do we have challenges? Sure, but don't we have challenges now?
Yeah. And you rightly state that Texas is huge in terms of their economy. Texas is 1.59 trillion, 10th in the world. How much of that money comes from the federal government?
If you listen to the pundits and the pollsters, particularly of the progressive variety, they will tell you that Texas can't survive without federal money. But when you take the federal pension benefits out of the equation, what you end up with is Texas overpaying anywhere from $103 to $160 billion annually into the federal system. That's like Hurricane Harvey hitting Texas every 9 months. That giant sucking sound of money going into the pockets of Washington bureaucrats, never to be seen again.
It's kind of like I tell people when they get a divorce, you don't get rid of your problem, you just get a new set of problems. Do you in any way think that you're trading one government for another government, that you're not going to have a lot of the same issues with a government as big as the one that Texas or California would have? I mean, come on, human nature is what it is.
Look, we're not promising utopia, but what we do have that is different than our arrangement that we have with Washington, D.C., is we have a say in it. You know, you'll get a chance to go vote for president right now in the upcoming federal election. You can vote for your congressman. Guess who's never on the ballot? The 2.5 million unelected federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. that are actually running things.
Yeah, I get that. What I'm saying is you're acting like you have some new system that you aren't going to have bureaucrats in there. Are you kidding me?
You're going to have government, but you're not going to have 2.5 million unelected federal bureaucrats with 440 separate agencies.
Yeah, you have a lot of buts in your argument, and but means forget what I just said. I'm now going to tell you what I really mean. You're going to be facing the same situation you're facing there, just on a smaller scale with fewer resources.
Well, but we have a say in the matter.
In 2008, I moved to New Hampshire to be with a bunch of like-minded libertarians. It was an amazing experience, and I love it there. Over the next 4 years, I discovered that there was an appetite amongst Granite Staters for independence. So then we thought, can we peacefully secede from the US? And how would we do that? We started the Foundation for New Hampshire Independence, and its mission is to secede from the US government. We all understand now the system is broken. Undeclared wars, too much money printing, the inflation, it's not sustainable. New Hampshire citizens pay more in federal taxes to the government than we get back. And that obviously is not really a sustainable model, and why would we sign up for it? If New Hampshire was its own country, we would be a prosperous little country. Geographically, we'd be bigger than countries in Europe. Population-wise, we'd be 4 times the size of Iceland. We'd be able to export energy. New Hampshire has a nuclear plant that no one talks about. We have a deep sea port. So in some ways, New Hampshire could become like a little Hong Kong to the whole eastern seaboard, where we're more prosperous than we could be under the federal government.
Does it ever seem a little far-fetched to you, or do you really feel like this can and is going to happen?
I believe it's not if, but when. And I think a lot of that is just tied to the unsustainable federal debt. I mean, we're $34 trillion in debt, and there is just no way we're going to be able to pay that off. So I think we're looking at a dollar collapse, and if that's the case, let's come up with solutions to the problem.
In New Hampshire, you've been taking the benefit of that debt, so I assume when you secede, you would take your portion of that debt.
Well, you know, we pay more in taxes to the federal government than we get back.
Well, you said that Texas is the same way. You pay more. But according to openbooks.com, Texas is not a donor state. It is a taker state and gets $184 billion more in federal aid than it sends to the federal government in taxes.
Yeah, that's not accurate.
Well, actually, it is accurate.
I would disagree, because what you will see is when these outlets decide they want to do the calculation, they will typically include the sum total of federal pension benefits. Federal pension benefits are payable regardless of where you live. I mean, how many expats do we know that have moved to other countries and still receive those federal pension benefits? So what they do is when you have—
a pretty big miss, $184 billion.
It is a big miss, but you know, and I will tell you—
Change to the federal government.
Well, and how much of that
one third of the funds in New Hampshire are made up by federal funds. The federal government spends $1,363 more per person in New Hampshire than it receives in taxes.
See, again, I think to Daniel's point, maybe we need to ask the question, who's coming up with the numbers, right? Obviously, the federal government is not incentivized.
It's a government watchdog that's not a friend to the government. It's a government watchdog organization.
Let's say the economics of it do make sense, or let's say that there are compelling reasons to do this, right? Then these become the questions we need to ask ourselves. How can we do this legally? How can we do this peaceably? You know, you hear people say the word civil war all the time, and I'm like, but what are you manifesting if you're coming to a discussion with that mindset? Why can't we come to the table with an amicable divorce, to go back to your sort of metaphor from earlier? Yep. Why can't we say, hey guys, this isn't working. This, you know, we have irreconcilable differences. We don't really like each other anymore. Let's come up with something that could work. And this isn't just a Texit thing. So I think the thing that we need to realize
You're from
and
South
recognize—
Africa, right?
Yes, originally. Yep, I won a green card in the lottery. Pretty sure someone's going to regret that.
I doubt it. Well, there are secession movements: California, Texas, Vermont, New Hampshire, Alaska, and Hawaii. Nobody in the middle. What do you want to say?
So Texas is receiving benefits from the federal government. Is this through tax revenue, or is this through print up money? Mm-hmm. That's a problem. Where's this going to end? where's this going to end? I mean, how long can we continue to turn this magic money machine on? And there's countries all over the planet that are starting to hedge their bets on this. And so what happens when we're no longer the world reserve currency? Okay, who's going to pay all those benefits anyway?
You're making a lot of my arguments. We can't just keep printing money because that cheapens everybody's money, and I agree with you. I just don't necessarily agree with the solution because I think it's fraught with problems that can make it unworkable. Now, you've run for the New Hampshire State Senate,
Yep.
right? 3 times?
Yes.
How'd you do?
So I started at 35%. I was an entirely unknown, and I run Republican. I myself am authentically out there doing what I'm doing. And I went up to 46%. I was definitely going to win in 2022. Surprisingly, my district got gerrymandered out. The more conservative side got totally moved away. I got the inner city as my district. I looked at the PVI, it just didn't make sense, so I chose not to run in 2022 for Senate. I did actually run for the House, and I only lost by 200 votes.
Well, good for you.
Thank you.
You say the idea of secession would work. You think you may be 20 years early?
You know, I mean, everything takes time, right? The fact that we're having these discussions is the start of it. I'm solution-driven, and I'm saying, look, if these are the problems that we cannot solve, and Dr. Phil, no one here can tell us one thing that has been reformed in the federal government in the past 50 years. So when people say to me, but we need to fix it in DC, I'm like, how? How are we supposed to fix it? It is unfixable. It is corrupt and rotten, and it cannot be fixed. So what we need to do is we need to go back to smaller locales, more localism, so that, you know what, you asked about, well, you know, we're just gonna have another government in DC or in Texas or in New Hampshire, say, but that government will be smaller, it will be less corrupt, and there's a more direct line between you as a citizen and your legislators. And in New Hampshire, we have a massive legislature. There are 400 people who represent a population of 1.2, 1.4 million. You have their number on speed dial. They get paid $100 a year, so they're uncorruptible old citizens who really care about the state. And I would rather have those people than the invisible deep state that we know is not making our lives better.
Right.